With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into Tactics. We thank you for joining us, whether you're watching on Facebook Live, on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, wherever you happen to be watching us. We appreciate you making us a part of your day. So, lots to get to today. An interesting report, which we'll start out on, came from Axios. And Axios did a study, and it's actually done pretty well, pretty in-depth. And what it did was it took a look specifically at the tariffs that are going to be enacted by China as a response to what's going on. And this is really one of the big reasons that I say reciprocal tariffs are not necessarily a great idea. Originally, I happen to be in favor of them. But the problem is, and somebody completely changed my mind on reciprocal tariffs in essentially 5 seconds when he said, well, what about the things that you export more than you import and vice versa? And I thought about that. I was like, well, yeah, reciprocal tariffs wouldn't really work if you're a country, for example, that has a lot of oil, but don't import a lot of oil. So all you would have to do is put tariffs on oil from foreign places. And then, I mean, essentially that's the problem with reciprocal tariffs. I mean, on its surface, it seems right. Because all you would have to do is if somebody slaps a tariff on one of your goods, all you do is slap them with a tariff on the same good. The problem is if they don't export a whole lot to you, in other words, if you're not taking in a lot of their product, then that tariff doesn't limit their access to your marketplace nearly as much as it may your access to their marketplace. And so reciprocal tariffs, they're correct in theory and correct in principle, but that only works if everybody has roughly the same amount of everything and everybody sells the same amount of everything. That's not how this works. 5 minutes of playing Settlers of Catan will tell you some players have more goods in some areas than they do other. If you're like me, somehow you always wind up with all the sheep. But enough board game references for now. That's one of the big problems you have with reciprocal tariffs. And one of this study essentially went through each state, and it found out which out of all of the states would be hurt the most by these tariffs that are going to be retaliated by China, because China is going to retaliate not by slapping tariffs on steel, for example. What they're going to do is they're going to retaliate by slapping tariffs on something they buy a lot of American goods. So in their case, a big one, which is going to hit Alabama pretty hard, soybeans. China imports a lot of soybeans. They import a lot of soybeans, and Alabama produces a good chunk of those soybeans. I don't think that we're actually the top producer, but the point is there's a thriving soybean market in Alabama. And I won't go into all the specifics, but I do want an excuse to use my very expensive ag degree from Auburn. Part of the reason for that is the same reason that there's a big peanut market here in Alabama, because like the peanut, a soybean is a legume. And because of that, that sandy soil that we have a lot of in South Alabama, it doesn't have enough nitrogen. That's why legumes are a great choice to put in sandy soil, is because they have tiny nodes on their roots that produce their own nitrogen. So that's your little fun scientific ag fact for the day. That's the reason that Alabama has especially in the southern part of the state, has an ideal climate suited for the growing of legumes. Soybeans happens to be one of them, and because of that, there are a lot of Alabama soybeans that wind up in China. It's a great market. It's a great opportunity for us. That is going to be somewhat hurt because of what's going on with the trade war in China, and soybean is one of the commodities that they are specifically threatening to raise if Trump doesn't lower the tariffs. And you may recall, it was about 3 days ago at midnight that we slapped on the extra tariffs, and this is the problem with the trade war escalating. China's always had tariffs on American goods and vice versa. We've always had tariffs on Chinese goods. But now we're talking about escalating that, and already have escalated it by 15%. China is saying that they're going to retaliate. Trump is saying if they retaliate, then we're going to retaliate and put even bigger tariffs. This is why nobody wins a trade war, because all you do is ratchet up tariffs on one another and basically play a game of chicken with one another. But in the meantime, your citizens are suffering because the prices of their consumer goods are going up by a substantial amount. And so it's a war that nobody ever wins. That's the long and the short of it. But this new study says that out of all the commodities that are apt to be hit by tariffs, out of these states, the 4 biggest ones are going to be Louisiana, Alaska, South Carolina, and then Alabama. So why is Alabama so high on this list? Well, the way that they did it, and the way sort of their parameters for determining which states were going to be hit hardest, is 1.5% of our GDP for our state will be directly affected by Chinese products. And so to give you an explanation of exactly what that means, our gross domestic product, in other words, the total sum of all the wealth and product created in the state of Alabama, approximately 1.5% of that, it deals directly with goods that are imported from China. And to give you a little bit of understanding on this, if you've ever watched Milton Friedman's The Pencil, it's essentially, and I know this sounds boring, but it's actually fascinating. It's a documentary on how you make a pencil. And hilariously, it's a pencil that's made in the USA. But the point is, and the reason that it's emphasizing is not so you know how pencils are made. It's not one of those like how it works things that you see on History Channel. The point of it is for you to understand where all these products come from and the international trade involved in that. For example, in Malaysia, they have rubber trees. And that's where the rubber for your eraser comes from. And so even the pencil itself might be assembled in the United States. You still had to have the rubber from Malaysia to get to the factory in the United States to put the eraser on the pencil. And I won't go into all the details here, but suffice it to say that it is crucially important, even for products that are made here in the U.S., that we are able to have free trade with other countries and be able to trade and get their goods at a low price. We've already seen this even with American brands like Whirlpool, and even the products that they actually assemble here in the United States. We're seeing the prices of their appliances go up because of the steel that was imported from other countries. That causes a rift, it causes a distortion in the market, and so even if they buy American steel, the price of that steel is now higher because there's less supply in the American steel market. So even if you're buying American products that were made here, your prices still go up regardless, because there's less total material for you to buy from. And the reason that this specifically will affect Alabama is because we create a lot of products that are petroleum-based. In other words, plastics. And because specifically we use plastics in a lot of our manufacturing, and specifically what it's talking about here is we're big into the automotive industry and we're big into the aerospace industry. So not only do you have the aerospace, well, I wouldn't say the capital of the world, but it's certainly one of the most important aerospace cities in the country, Huntsville. You've got all them creating aircrafts and spaceships and different parts for that. You've got that. That's kind of a small percentage of it. But on the much larger scale, you've also got, right here in Montgomery, for example, Hyundai. You've got Mercedes-Benz in Alabama. I mean, you have all these different places, all these different plants, Toyota, and a lot of those are going to see a increase in prices, which means a decrease in sales, which means that there are going to be people that make either less money because they're working less hours or lose their jobs altogether. Now, I don't think that this is going to be a fire and brimstone, the economy is going to crash tomorrow and Alabama is going to be a third world country. I'm not trying to be an alarmist here. I'm just saying you have to recognize, especially because of the abundance of petroleum-based products that Alabama produces and how important that is to our economy is going to take a hit. Doesn't necessarily it's going to be the Great Depression, but it is going to be a hit. There's going to be less money in the average person's pocket in the state of Alabama because of these tariffs. And that's just the bottom line. And like I said, you've got the cars and aircrafts that are going to be hurt. You have soybean farmers that are going to take a pretty big hit. But here's the thing. All of this is small potatoes compared to what the tariffs are going to affect us. What I mean by that is, even though we do have a soybean industry, even though we do have a lot of petroleum-based products that we create here in Alabama in manufacturing, the main thing that is going to hurt our economy is not that, and it's not specific to one state because it's a nationwide tariff. The main thing that is going to hurt is that we have $200 billion of new taxes that are going to be passed along to the customer. There's going to be $200 billion less dollars in the American economy than there were before. It's sad, but that's the truth. And no matter how they frame it, no matter how they try to cast it as some kind of conservative principle, conservative idea, even though there's nothing conservative about it, ultimately there will be $200 billion that was in the American economy that now isn't. Now, you may say overall that's pocket change, overall that's not a lot. Okay, well, maybe it's not a lot, but it is something. And that is money that could be used to create more goods and services that now is not going to be. And if this thing continues to go further, in other words, if they start ratcheting up the tariffs even more, it's going to get even worse. That's going to be the real source of economic heartache. Now, the limited access to the market of China, the tariffs that they slap on us are going to create, it's going to affect us, but it's going to be minimal compared to that. And this is what I've always said from the very beginning. Tariffs, especially when you're saying that we want free trade, but we're going to enact tariffs if somebody else does, that is like a pacifist seeing a man shoot himself in the foot and saying, well, clearly pacifism doesn't work, and then shooting himself in the foot. Like, I'm not even a pacifist, but my point is, somebody else breaking your ideology does not mean your ideology does not work. Somebody else, and inflicting pain upon yourself, inflicting pain upon the American consumer in the form of higher prices is not a smart strategy to try to combat the Chinese. The Chinese are bad actors. There is no question about that. They are horrible when it comes to things like intellectual property. They have no problem just straight up stealing things from American designers and creating the product themselves and selling it and not giving a dime to American producers. Yes, that's wrong. Yes, that's illegal. That is a horrible thing. But there's been no historic evidence whatsoever, anytime we've ever tried it, that tariffs are going to get the Chinese to stop stealing intellectual property. There are ways that we can do the best that we can to try to prevent them from doing it, but they are a sovereign nation, and there's very little that we can do to stop that. Believe me, if I thought that tariffs were actually going to work and China was actually just going to stop knocking off our designs, I would say go for it. But there is absolutely no reason to believe, historically or right now, that China has any intention of cracking down on the theft of American intellectual property. And it makes no sense to punish the American consumer in the meantime to try to test this out. That's the problem that I have with this. Tom Cotton, for example, Senator Tom Cotton, said today that trying to justify the tariff, saying, well, the pain that is going to be felt by the American consumer with tariffs, that's nothing compared to what our vets go through. Okay, that's accurate, but I don't see why that's an argument for tariffs. I mean, that would be like saying, I'm going to enact a policy tomorrow that every American must slice off their right hand. And then they ask me, well, why do you think that's a good idea? Well, having your right hand sliced off is nothing like being a POW. Well, yes, but that has nothing to do with it being a good policy. Other people getting hurt and saying that there are worse things that can happen to you in life does not make your plan good. Just because a plan is bad and saying, well, there's a worse plan that exists in the world does not mean that that plan is now a good plan. It may be better than that, but it doesn't make it necessary, and it doesn't make it a good plan. So, yes, China is a bad actor. Yes, China does need to be reined in and punished, but there's not a way to do that, especially not with tariffs. Now, we could slap some economic sanctions on them. We could try to navigate through the TTP was an attempt to try to rein China in on some of this stuff, and it wound up not working. We were going to try to squeeze the nations around China away from using Chinese goods to get them to try to stop building these knockoffs. But Donald Trump pulled out of that, so that's gone. And our means to try to get China to stop doing that are very limited, and tariffs have never worked in the past for that. The bottom line is this is a very, very poor strategy for combating China. Just because China is a bad actor does not justify any means that you could do it against them. For example, let's say in World War II, you had a general say, all right, what we're going to do is when we go into this battle with the Nazis, we're going to have our tanks turn their guns in the opposite direction and start shooting that way. Well, General, won't that hit our troops? Well, yeah, but the Nazis are terrible. Well, yeah, the Nazis are terrible. That doesn't make this a good plan. And so there are better ways to handle this than just justifying everything with saying, well, China's bad. Well, yes, China's bad, but that doesn't mean that this is going to work. And that's the problem that I continuously have with this. It looks like we have a caller on line 1, so we'll go ahead and go to the phones. Good afternoon. What's your name?
My name is Caleb.
Hey, well, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, you hit on a couple of things that really kind of just it sparked my mind. Number one is, and speaking as a conservative, I hate the idea that China's coming in with these brands of knockoff. But
absolutely,
an idea of outsourcing American work. You know, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, you had men and women that actually took pride in tags that said "Made in the USA."
Absolutely,
not something that was necessarily against the Chinese as a people, but the fact of the matter is we took some sort of pride in our work. We had
and it wasn't that people that were buying those products, it wasn't that they hated everybody else. It's just that they loved America, and that's the reason that they wanted to have something that was a U.S. made product.
No, and here's the one thing is a lot of people would argue, like, these people take pride in their work. Like, no, there's a lot of people that they're actually doing the work. It's not so much of, you know, how China mass produces things. It's because they have a bunch of people in their factories that are working at a very, very low income that they're charging. And it's the same way with Mexico. It's the same way with Venezuela. It's the same way with South Korea. These people make things in mass production with very little wages. So economically speaking, they're like, hey, this is the smartest thing ever. Well, okay, but at the same time, you're taking away pride from millions of Americans that took pride in their work. You spoke on tariffs and how they affect the economy as is. I mean, you're taking punches out of farmers, and agriculture used to be one of the backbones. But look at the transportation industry. You know, we used to be one of the most thriving industries in the United States and the most profitable, but now we have the highest demand for drivers across the United States because we don't have the feet on the ground to go and take care of this business.
Yeah, I believe the transportation industry right now, if I'm not mistaken, it's the fourth or fifth largest industry for employment in America. I mean, it's way up there. There are a lot of truckers and drivers.
Absolutely, but it also ranks in one of the highest in demand. There's 2.4 million truck drivers across the United States, and yet that's still not enough to clear our freight base. Matter of fact, the railroad system has started to cover so much that the intermodal industry has grown in rapid succession over the process of 5 to 10 years because we don't have enough to meet our customers' criteria on getting the loads there on time and in order. At the same time, now they're having to wait. Now we're costing money. Now we're costing customers money, and customers are getting upset about that. It's not because we lack the ingenuity, we lack the motivation to keep running. It's because we lack the people to get it done.
Right. So it's a manpower issue.
Absolutely. And, but at the same time, people don't want to make the sacrifice. I don't want to spend months and years away from my family. I don't want to not be there if something happens. So I'm automatically retaliating, or I'm stepping back from the responsibilities of the transportation industry. And these fresh new ideas come out: higher pay, better home time. It's not quite covering what could happen out there on the road. And but at the same time, that's one thing we're lacking. As the years move forward, less people want to do the work that was commonplace in the past decades. It's one thing that I deeply have gone to be disappointed in, is the fact that we do outsource to other countries, and it has taken away our pride and our motivation to work and be proud of our work and what we've done.
Well, you bring up an interesting point there, because especially since you seem to be somebody that's in the transportation industry. I'm pretty sure I know who you are now. But
yeah, I was gonna say, you had my sister on the show.
Yeah, okay. You are that Caleb then. Okay. I thought so. But anyway, it's an interesting quandary that you bring up, because the thing about tariffs and limiting imports would actually benefit. Like I said, tariffs do help specifically the industries that they wind up tariffing. They just do it at the expense of everybody else. And so what happens there is you are going to have some jobs saved. For example, since we're doing steel tariffs, you're going to have some steel and aluminum jobs that are saved, but you're doing so at the cost of other jobs. And one of the things that's specific to that is importers, exporters, and people in the transportation industry that move those products, some of which are manufactured at least partially or completely overseas. And you're limiting demand and you're limiting purchasing from those people, which means that there is less demand for transportation as well. And so, you're actually in a position, you're in an industry that will be directly adversely affected by less robust trade.
Correct. We do take a lot of imports and exports. The only issue that I have with that is with what we have at hand in the United States, we could easily replace what we have in import and export with just cross-country movement. Matter of fact,
it depends on the product, but yes.
Well, yeah, it depends on the product, but at the same time, I can tell you that in terms of transportation, to keep electricity, keep the lights on through nuclear power plants, coal plants, things like that, we still have the ability and resources to make it on our own.
We could be mostly energy independent if we lowered some of our regulations. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to general freight, things like, Walmart freight, Target freight, Kroger freight, any of the small mom and pop companies, we still have that covered. A lot of the made in China stuff is limited to certain things, but at the same time, you have regulation. As much as tariffs has posed a threat on the American economy, so has laws that we've governed to limit the ability to move freight in a successful manner. You look frowned upon. This is the biggest issue in the transportation industry as a whole, is there are companies out there that are willing to literally scrape the bottom of the barrel, hiring inexperienced, new-made truck drivers that do not know the process of the road. However, the federal government instills laws that will allow them to target trucks and companies directly, making a large amount of income for the state. I can tell you that Alabama as a whole is probably one of the more lenient of these states in terms of getting trucks into weight stations, properly doing DOT inspections and citing them for that. But if you look at California, which is the widest of the liberal states in the United States, you go in there with a truck at all, you're almost guaranteed to get pulled over. They look for any and all problems. They're going to cite you for it. And from fines that can span from $150 to $25,000+ for the driver alone, and doubling or almost tripling that for the company, you can see where people pinpoint their sources of income. Not so much on the American civilian, but on the profession.
Yeah,
of the American.
Well, I got to tell you, Caleb, I do appreciate your call, and I appreciate your insight on that. And you and I are in complete agreement on that. Tariffs are a drag on the economy, but they're not quite as big a danger as regulation. And one of the things that we've actually seen, because I talked about this Friday on the show, one of the reasons that this economy has been doing so well is that the main thing that the Trump administration has done, I think that has had an even bigger impact on the economy than the tax cuts, is the fact that under the Obama administration, you were seeing hundreds of pages of regulation a month. I remember that Mike Lee actually showed all of the regulation that had been passed just in 1 year, and it was taller than I am, and I'm 6'3". Just page after page of printer paper stacked on top of one another in new regulation. Well, of course that's a massive drag on the economy. There is a cost of compliance associated with each of those regulations, and you multiply that by the sheer volume and the amount that we were actually creating under the Obama administration, and you contrast that right now to where in the Trump administration, there's actually been a net loss. In other words, there has been a decrease in regulation compared to the increase. There have been some new regulations, but they've been offset by and large by a decrease in the regulation state, which in my opinion, maybe with the exception of Neil Gorsuch, is the biggest accomplishment of the Trump administration. So no argument there. You and I are in complete agreement on that. Economically, there's no question that regulation is just as much a danger to our economy as tariffs are. But that really does what it's all boils down to. Now, we have a Biscuits game tonight on our sister station, Sports Radio 740, just back in the other studio here. And I have to go run that. So we're going to go ahead and wrap things up real quickly. But before we do, I've got one story before we get to the chaplain's report, because I had to cover this one. So apparently, and it never ceases to amaze me. It never ceases to amaze me the length that liberals will go to try to destroy those that they despise, and that is why we are going to go ahead and go to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
So today's daily dose of stupid, and you probably guessed what it was looking at my shirt. Yes, once again, they're going after Chick-fil-A. The Cal Poly San Luis Obispo Abiso, I can't pronounce these names. Why is your university's name this long in the first place? Auburn. That's all you need. One word. Or even if you're like NYU, you have an acronym. Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. You guys got to do something about that name. But nonetheless, they are the university that recently voted to boot Chick-fil-A off of campus. According to LifeSite News, voted overwhelmingly. The faculty tried to boot Chick-fil-A off campus, and so it looks like they're going to be booted off of campus. The Academic Senate Vice Chair, Tom Gutierrez, said, and I quote, "We don't sell pornography in the bookstore, and we don't have a Hooters on campus. We already pre-select those kind of things based on our existing values. This is a similar thing. The difference is we're actually profiting from this. So our money, every dollar a student is spending at Chick-fil-A, is going to these causes that are in violation of our values." So apparently eating a Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich is tantamount to porn and eating at Hooters. Now, the chicken's good, but it ain't that good. I don't know what they think this chicken is doing to people, but it's not porn. There's a very different physical reaction going on here. I guess the chicken, it tastes fine, but it's not that. And it's just so ridiculous. Some of the arguments that they'll try to make of how this makes any sense. And here's a big problem with making that comparison. Even if you take the silliness and the ridiculousness out of it for a second, what you're trying to do is say, this is a product that we disagree with. There is a moral issue with the product. In Chick-fil-A, that's not the case. You see, when you're talking about Hooters, and they actually have proven this in a court case because there was a guy that tried to sue Hooters for discrimination. This was, I don't know, a long time ago, probably 10 years ago now. A guy tried to sue Hooters for discrimination because he was a man and Hooters would not hire him. And I believe actually there were women that did the same thing, saying that Hooters rejected them and rejected their application for work because they weren't attractive enough. There are standards that Hooters has because, according to them, this is Hooters saying this, not me. They said, and their estimation was, that part of the experience, part of what you're paying for when you purchase a meal at Hooters is the eye candy. That is a part of the product. That's a part of the ambiance. It's just like the Nike swoosh on the side of a Nike shoe. That's part of what you're paying for. You're paying for the branding. You're paying to be there and be served by voluptuous women. Now, I've never been inside a Hooters, have no desire to ever be inside a Hooters. I don't go there specifically because I disagree with them essentially selling, looking at scantily clad women as a part of their product. But both with that and with pornography, the problem is the product itself. The product itself is what's immoral. And so he's trying to make a one-to-one comparison where there's not one. In one case, you have Hooters, which granted isn't morally as bad as pornography, but still, it's the same thing. It's still lust. It leads to the same sin. There is a violation of values, which I can understand a university not wanting to have that on their campus. You're looking at the product itself being a problem, being something that could cause somebody to engage in an immoral action. That's the problem that you have with things like pornography and Hooters. No such association with Chick-fil-A. The problem that people have with Chick-fil-A and referring to them as anti-homosexual or homophobic or whatever is because their president, Dan Cathy, who is not even alive anymore, used to say things which I agreed with. He essentially just believed in the biblical stance on marriage. A man and a woman for life, and anything other than that is incorrect. That is the biblical view of sexuality, which is held by millions of Christians across the country. That was his personal stance. Chick-fil-A does not keep gay people from eating at their restaurant. They do not discriminate against them when they're looking for a job there. This is just a stance held by the founder and the family that owns the company. And in their personal donations, in their personal lives, they give to organizations. And I don't even think they give to organizations that are quote-unquote anti-gay. They just give to Christian organizations that hold similar biblical views about sexuality and morality. And this has become a big problem for them. The Chick-fil-A company itself, the product, a chicken sandwich, a waffle fry, a milkshake, whatever it may be, is not the same thing as the product itself in the case of porn or in the case of Hooters being sold to someone. You're not selling them a I hate gay people t-shirt. You're selling them a chicken sandwich. So to try to make this one-to-one comparison between the two is just so incredibly absurd, because there's absolutely no connection between the chicken sandwich, between the waffle fry, and the other person. Does that enrich a family that owns the company that may then turn around and give to an organization that you don't like? Well, yeah, maybe. But that's really different than buying the product itself. For example, everybody knows how strongly I feel about abortion. I'm very much against I'm very much against abortion, very pro-life. But if I buy a product for somebody and that person then goes out and with their personal money, not the company money, gives donations to companies that I disagree with, there's very little that I can do about that. And if that's the standard that you're going for, then there is not a company left on this earth that you can buy anything from. Because let's say that Chick-fil-A, well, let's just use a random company. Let's just use, I don't know, Walmart. I'll just pull one off the top of my head. If a Walmart employee goes out and then gives money to a organization like the Alliance Defending Freedom that was against the Obergefell case, does that mean you can no longer buy things from Walmart because part of that money that you spent at Walmart went towards paying that employee's salary? I'm not talking about a bigwig or a manager. I'm talking about a guy running a cash register. Because if that's going to be your standard, well, that money eventually winds up there. Well, then you can't spend money at any place because there are always going to be a diverse number of views and a diverse number of donations given by the individual employees that make money off of that product. It's a really ridiculous standard that people are trying to hold themselves to now, and it really makes no sense. This is why, and I want to point out that at the end of that, they said, also, this is different because we're making a profit off this. Yes, the reason that you're making a profit off this is because people want to buy the waffle fries and chicken sandwiches. You see, the free market is the ultimate popularity contest. I can understand if there is a company you actually do have a moral problem with. For example, there are companies that do support Planned Parenthood that I specifically don't buy products for. But that's the company supporting it. And another thing, too, if you're going to do that, if you're going to have that stance, you need to remember that popularity, if you're wanting to determine popularity, the free market is the ultimate place for that, because people don't just vote with whether they like something or not. It's not like an online poll where you say, yep, I like that. You actually go out and spend your hard-earned money on something. So obviously, if there was a profit being made at this Chick-fil-A on campus, that means that it's very abundantly clear that the majority of your students didn't have a problem with it. Chick-fil-A or any company thriving in any location means that there is a marketplace, a demand for their product in that place. And that's why I've always said that capitalism is the ultimate popularity contest. If you want to know whether something's if you want to know whether something is going to be popular or not, put it in a marketplace, put it up for sale. If people buy a lot of it, it's popular. The reverse is true with a lot of these government programs. I love it when liberals go, well, socialism is really popular. Social Security, for example, which is not really socialism. I mean, it's a socialistic, I won't get into all the technical details, but it is socialistic somewhat in its nature, but it's not full-on socialism just because a country happens to have a retirement plan. It has a tendency, but that doesn't make the whole thing socialist. Anyway, when it comes to Social Security, they'll say, Social Security is very popular. Oh, it's popular? Okay, then give people the option to opt out or opt in. People can opt out. They don't get any payments from Social Security, but they also don't pay into the system. And then they'll immediately say, well, you can't do that. Everybody will decide not to opt in. Well, then it's not very popular, is it? If people will not put their money towards it, then they don't like it very much. If people are putting their money towards it, like they are here with Chick-fil-A, it's obviously something that is liked by a lot of people. If I'm not mistaken, they're the third most profitable fast food chain on earth. And that they're doing something right, guys. And that's not because everybody that eats there hates gay people, or I wouldn't even say that the majority of the people or the people in the store even hate gay people. I mean, I don't. Dan Cathy didn't. And so it's not because of that. They're not associating the product with the politics. They're just buying the product. And they should, because the product isn't directly correlated with the behavior that's being talked about here. But I will say this to their credit. One dude on the left finally gets it. I'm going to read this quote by university spokesman Matt Laser, which, by the way, that is the coolest last name ever, Matt Laser. He sounds like an action star. So Matt Laser, while university administration passionately disagrees with the values of some organizations, the president of Chick-fil-A has chosen to make a personal donations to. We do not believe in responding to intolerance with intolerance. Rather, we must model our values of inclusion. That means upholding the rights of others to have different perspectives and ensuring there is space in our community for differing viewpoints and ideologies. even those that may be in direct conflict with our own. Thank you. Someone finally gets it. The idea that, well, you're a bigot, so we're not going to associate with you anymore. Well, that makes you a bigot. If you can't stand the idea of somebody else, if you can't stand the idea of an imposing viewpoint having a voice, then you're the one that's being a tyrant. You're the one that's being a fascist. Finally, somebody on the left realized, well, if our main complaint is going to be that they're not tolerant enough, it's probably not a good idea to respond by kicking that person out. This is somebody that doesn't like Chick-fil-A. This is somebody that is saying, we disagree with some of the organizations their president donated to. We disagree with some of the values of the founder of Chick-fil-A. But are we really going to win anybody over? Are we really going to be able to, I guess, convince somebody that they're being intolerant or that they should be more open to other ideas by saying, get out of here. We don't want you anymore. Once you do that, you're the one that's being intolerant. And finally, somebody on the left figured this out. There is someone on the left that is actually using their brain and thinking. Congratulations. But what it all boils down to is freedom is about making choices. Freedom is about making choices and affording others that same choice. You may disagree with their choice. You may tell them that they're wrong in making that choice. But at the end of the day, if we value freedom, we will say to other people, look, don't agree with the choice that you're making, don't necessarily like what you're saying, but you have the freedom to do it. See, that's the difference here. People that are authoritarian, people that want to control other people, they really think that they know best. They think they know better than you about these decisions. They think all these people, oh, they're just a bunch of idiots going out and eating Chick-fil-A and eating their sandwiches and their fries. And the only way that we could save them, because if they really knew what was going on behind the scenes, and most of them do and don't care, but if they only really knew what Chick-fil-A was really standing for, then they wouldn't buy that. And so they're not smart enough to make their own decisions. We have to rush in and make the right decision for them. Nobody should have that level of power. I personally, and I won't go into all the reasons why, I don't care much for Target. I don't shop at Target. That's it. I don't go on crusades. And if anybody asks me why, I'll tell them. If that convinces them not to shop at Target, fine. If it doesn't, fine. I'm not going to try to keep people from going to Target. I'm not going to try to get Target kicked out of my town. If people want to buy from Target, that's their business. And I would like other people on the other side of the aisle to extend that same courtesy to others. They don't have to eat at Chick-fil-A. That's fine. If they don't like the values of the founder, they don't have to do it. They don't have to buy there. But I don't understand this. They can even tell other people that they shouldn't eat at Chick-fil-A. That's fine. That's part of free speech. But once you try to remove the wrong choice from other people because they're not smart enough to figure it out on their own, that's what makes you a fascist. That moves you into the intolerant camp. That moves you into the I'm going to make decisions for other people. And it's the antithesis of liberty. It's the antithesis of free speech. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today, we're going to kind of take a step back just so we can look at another aspect of this. And this is something that really struck me today because of a conversation that I had. We're going to look in the book of Daniel And you remember we were about to move into Daniel and the Lion's Den, and I want to kind of, now that we've gone over King Darius's reaction to it, take a step backward just for a moment and look at something else that was a part of this. You may remember that King Darius was thinking about who he was going to appoint as his number 2 guy in the kingdom. There were several princes that were pretty sure that it was going to be Daniel, and because of that, they tried to figure out some way that they could get rid of Daniel. Best way they could do it is to tell the king to sign a decree saying that nobody shall make a petition to any god other than King Darius. And when they made that decree, they knew they had him. And the reason they knew they had him is because they knew that Daniel was had too much character, he was too principled to not pray to God. It's what he had done beforehand, he continued to do it, he knew about the law, didn't care. The world was not going to change who Daniel was, or what he did, or how he served God. And let's look back at this passage, because it is very telling, and it explains the reason that the king was unable to basically cry foul and say, well, I'm sorry, I made a mistake on that one. I'm just going to undo that last petition. So let's look at Daniel 6, verse 15. Then these men came by agreement to the king, and said to the king, Recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Now, what's important about that is that this law you couldn't undo. The king didn't want this to happen to Daniel. He allowed his own pride and his hubris to get in the way of his good thinking before making this proclamation. He didn't do it specifically to hurt Daniel. He would have never hurt Daniel. He and Daniel were good friends. But the law of the Medes and the Persians says, once the king has made a statute, once the king has made a law or an injunction, that's it. It does not change. Not even the king himself can go back and undo what he did. Think of it like an executive order, except you can completely override Congress with it. You don't even really need Congress to make law. Unfortunately, that's a little close to where it feels like that's close to where we are today. And once you've done that executive order, you can't do anything to alter it. You see, we took a look back at how Darius was incredibly distraught, didn't sleep all that night, worrying about Daniel, trying to figure out, or kind of reflecting and thinking back that it was really he that caused Daniel to be in the position that he was in. And the reason that that was true is because the law of the Medes and the Persians was that you couldn't undo it. Why was that the law? Why would the Medes and the Persians make it this way? I can't get into their mind, but I contend the reason this law was passed the way that it was when it did is because this was a fact of much of the ancient world. They believed that their rulers were completely infallible. They believed that there was divinity. And I'm not talking about the spark of divine that we all have, because they didn't believe that all children were the children of God. Remember, this is a paganistic society. They didn't believe that the common man had a spark of the divine, that only the kings, only the royals had that divine spark that made them essentially, if not wiser than everybody else, completely perfect. This is something that was especially true in Eastern cultures, and with the Medes and the Persians, as we're seeing here. There were people that believed that the king basically could do no wrong. And because of that, it was established in law that not even the king could undo his own law, because he's inerrant. He can't make mistakes. That's such an incredibly prideful thing to believe about human beings. And it's part of the reason that kings themselves are a bad idea. This is one of the things that we see God warning about when the children of Israel say, we want a king, give us a king like every other nation. And God's like, well, I'll give it to you if you really want one, but believe me, you ain't going to like it once you get it. Because he's going to levy taxes, he's going to send your sons off to war. You guys are not going to want a king. The judge system is better. And Israel ignored God and went ahead and demanded a king anyway. The reason that kings are such a bad idea is actually, oddly enough, and I didn't plan this, kind of similar to what we were just talking about, is that there are certain people that believe they are smarter and wiser and better than everybody else, and they have to make decisions for the people that are not as clever as they are. But the Bible teaches that we're all equals. The Bible teaches that no man is perfect and that we're all fallible and all have fallen and fallen short of the glory of God. That none of us we're not only perfect, we're incredibly fallible. And that we need to be aware of that so that we will be able to avoid mistakes in the future. The king ignores all of that. It assumes that the king is going to be wiser and smarter and more talented and better able to make decisions than everybody else, and because of that, it gave him basically unlimited power in most of the monarchical systems. And here we see one where King Darius, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, had absolute power and couldn't even undo something that he did because the assumption was that the king makes no bad decisions. What an incredibly arrogant thing to believe. And I think one of the things that really sparked this for me was I got into a discussion today about court precedent. And they were talking about how there was such a hesitancy on the Supreme Court to undo former Supreme Court precedent. Now, I'm not saying that the Supreme Court is exactly like a monarch or a dictator. And I'm also not suggesting that there's not some wisdom in that. There is some wisdom in looking back at the experiences of the past and trying to figure out why they thought that way, why they thought this was a good idea, and not just abandoning a system just because it's old and dusty. There is some wisdom in preserving some of our institutions and trying to understand why those institutions and those decisions were reached in the way that they were. So I'm not saying you abandon it completely, but it's also insanely arrogant to believe that they could not have made a mistake, whether you're talking about a king or whether you're talking about the Supreme Court in this instance. That you believe, well, we're not going to overturn court precedent because that's not the way that it's supposed to go. And luckily, our system does enable the Supreme Court to undo decisions made by a previous Supreme Court. But if they're going to be hesitant to do so, if they refuse to do so, then there are going to be a lot of bad decisions that were made that are going to stay on for a very long time. And so our chiefest concern must be with what is morally correct, not with sticking with a tradition because it's tradition. That was something that Medes and the Persians fell into, and had it not been for God intervening, it would have made an innocent man, in this case Daniel, lose his life for no reason. It's good for us to remember that we're flawed humans and the people in the past were flawed humans too, and for us to remember that and think, maybe they didn't get it right. And maybe we won't get it right this time, but we need to do the best that we can to try. Sometimes the wisest thing to do is to be aware of your own fallibility and the fallibility of those around you, and look to the Lord for proper guidance. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalrata Church of Christ. Copyright 20